Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture on photochemical smog for AP Environmental Science. We're going to talk about two learning objectives, that is topic 7.2, which is photochemical smog. The enduring understanding for this is that human activities have physical, chemical, and biological consequences for the atmosphere, which is pretty much a repeating theme throughout this entire unit. The learning objective, explain the causes and effects of photochemical smog and methods to reduce it. We're also going to talk about thermal inversions, which is topic 7.3. Same enduring understanding, and the learning objective is just describe thermal inversions and its relationship with pollution. Now, we have already talked about thermal inversions, but it was way back in August when we talked about layers of the atmosphere and atmospheric composition. But it is very applicable here because it really exacerbates photochemical smog and winter smog as well. So we'll talk about thermal inversions as well, but not as in depth as we would if we hadn't already talked about it. Vocab is short and sweet. And let's just get right into it. So you guys have all heard of smog, you've all seen smog, but what is smog? Smog is a portmanteau, meaning a combination of two words. So smoke and fog, they just took, SMOG, smog. And we'll typically categorize it either as winter smog or summer smog. And summer smog is the photochemical smog that we're going to focus on in this PowerPoint. So let's start with winter smog. I just have one slide on winter smog. Winter smog, as it aptly is called, usually occurs during the winter. During the winter, we have higher energy demands, typically for heat. So there's going to be a lot of people burning wood-burning stoves, maybe pellet stoves, people with fireplaces, people with maybe even coal stoves, depending on what part of the world or the country, the United States you're at. And all of those are going to create smoke and other particulate matter up in the atmosphere. We're also going to have higher energy demands at our power plants. So if we're trying to keep the heat on when it's negative 10 degrees outside, we're going to be using electricity for the most part. And a lot of the time that's going to be coming from coal burning power plants or other types of power plants that are running off of fossil fuels. So we're going to have some particulate matter in the atmosphere unless we're using natural gas power plants. Okay, all of that, as well as from traffic and industry, is going to create all this particulate matter in the atmosphere, which is winter smog. And it's going to be exacerbated by thermal inversions, which I have on a diagram on the right, but we'll talk about on the next slide. So thermal inversion occurs when we have a reversal of the normal air temperature. Usually what's going to happen is that the air in the troposphere is going to get colder as you increase in altitude. Okay, so at the normal situation here on the top right, we have warmer air down near the surface, right? The sunlight strikes the surface of the earth, warms the ground, the rocks, the asphalt, the concrete, etc., warms the air just above it, and we generally lose temperature as we go higher and higher up. Think about starting a climb on a mountain. You start at the valley below, and it's nice and warm, and then you climb further up into the mountain, and you get colder and colder and colder as you go higher up that mountain. Same thing. Now, sometimes there's going to be a temperature inversion or a thermal inversion, and that's where we get this layer of cold air that gets trapped underneath of this layer of warm air. Usually this is going to happen in a valley. So let's say that you can see that there's mountains on this diagram. So we got these mountains back here, okay? And this city is in a valley. What's going to happen is during the nighttime, everything's going to cool off. Like it's winter, the entire valley is going to become cold. All of the air around it is going to become cold. And then at dawn, the sun is going to rise, and that sunlight is going to start to strike the air above the mountain range, but the mountains are going to shade, let's say, the city down below. So it's not going to get any light. And this layer, this inversion layer, is going to warm up faster than that cold air down in the valley below. And it's going to create this temperature inversion. So you're going to have this warm air that's been heated up by the sun, whereas in the valley below, it's going to stay cold air because it's shaded by the mountains. And then as the day progresses, yes, this will start to warm up a little bit, but this cold air that's been trapped there overnight isn't really going to go anywhere. It's going to heat up slower than the air above it. and it's going to trap all of those pollutants in it as well, because the pollutants are going to want to rise, but they're going to want to, but then they'll hit this layer of warm air. They won't mix very well, and then they go back down into the city. And that leads to something like this, where we see this very distinct layer of smog. So all those pollutants from fireplaces, from traffic, from really anything going on in that city is getting trapped right there, in this case in Denver. But this often happens in the winter, and it is referred to as a thermal inversion. Okay? So that's winter smog. Winter smog, again, smoke, other pollutants, particulate matter, other pollutants released in the atmosphere during winter, and often exacerbated by thermal inversions. Now let's talk about summer smog. For the rest of this PowerPoint, I'm going to refer to summer smog as photochemical smog, because that's the term that you need to know. Okay? Photochemical smog occurs when sunlight reacts with water and pollutants in the atmosphere. Okay, so we're going to have some humidity. Even if it's a dry area, there's going to be some latent humidity, especially if we're doing combustion, right? Internal combustion engines or coal burning power plants, natural gas burning power plants, any type of combustion is going to release water vapor. So we have our water source, humidity, or even just a tiny bit of water in the atmosphere, sunlight, and then primary pollutants, especially nitrous oxides and volatile organic compounds. They're going to react in the atmosphere with oxygen, with other chemicals, or just with the light itself, and create a bunch of secondary pollutants. Those secondary pollutants include nitric acid, peroxyacetyl nitrates, aldehydes, and ozone. The two that you really need to know for the class is your ozone and your nitric acid. The volatile organic compounds, including your hydrocarbons, are going to stay in the atmosphere as well. Not all of them are going to react, but they're going to contribute to some of this photochemical smog too. Maybe if you have, a lot of sulfur oxides, sulfur dioxide released in the atmosphere, you might be making some sulfuric acid, but in general, it's your ozone and your nitric acid that are going to be your primary constituents of photochemical smog. And then a lot of secondary constituents, just depending on what is the primary pollutants in that area, okay? Because there's going to be a lot of different variations depending on your local emissions. And so I have another diagram of this, again, from industry, from internal combustion engines, really any type of combustion, you're going to release some nitrogen oxides, some nitrous oxides, and you're going to release some hydrocarbons that escape combustion, some volatile organic compounds or hydrocarbons. The nitrogen oxides, the nitrogen oxides are going to produce nitric acid. They're also going to produce your PANs and your ozone. The hydrocarbons that can come off from incomplete combustion or just degas off of, chemical solvents or from oil tanks, from natural gas wells, those are going to react with the UV light as well and create your aldehydes, including formaldehyde and acrylamide. Okay, but again, the ones that you really need to know is O3 and HNO3, which is nitric acid. So one thing that I hope that you notice on the previous slides that you need for photochemical smog is sunlight. You need primarily those ultraviolet wavelengths, but sunlight in general. So photochemical smog is called summer smog because it occurs most often in the summer because your sunlight is the highest and you also need heat for these chemical reactions to occur. So summer smog is your photochemical smog. Okay. Now that's in the higher latitudes. If you're in the tropics, it can be year-round, especially if you're in a dry area. Someplace like Cairo that really doesn't have a wet season is going to have photochemical smog pretty much the entire year round. Or it could just be during the dry season. Someplace like Bangladesh may just have photochemical smog during the dry season, and then during the wet season, there's so much rain that washes these chemicals out of the atmosphere that settles them onto the ground that they don't have photochemical smog during the wet season. Okay. If we think about what cities are going to have photochemical smog, it's going to be mostly cities that are sunny, warm, and dry. Think Denver, Los Angeles. You're not going to have as much in your wet cities. Charlotte, North Carolina isn't going to have as much photochemical smog as Los Angeles or San Diego will, just because of the climate, right? There's more humidity, but more importantly, it's going to rain more often during the summer. And again, that rain absorbs some of these pollutants and deposits them on the ground or in your waterways. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing, especially for your soil and your waterways, but it means that you're not breathing in as much smog. Okay. And if we think about what time of day these emissions start, so if we draw a graph of one day and we have the concentration of these different chemicals, so we'll say like chemical concentration, the brackets mean concentration, and then time. Starting early in the morning, I'll say that nitrous oxide is red, and then that ozone is going to be green. Okay, so early in the day, because of people commuting to work, your nitrous oxides are going to peak, and then they might peak again later on in the day at the afternoon commute. After they've really after there's lots of nitrous oxides in the atmosphere, they can react and create ozone, and you need that sunlight for the creation of ozone. So your ozone is going to peak midday and then taper off later on in the evening. Okay, so these nitrous oxides are going to create that ozone. So it's going to have a different chemical signature. Your smog is going to be different at different parts of the day. Your nitrous oxide is typically peaking early in the morning with the commute, and as people turn on electricity and draw more from the power plants and they increase supply, and then the ozone follows that, and you typically have high levels of ozone midday. Now, quick review of nitrous oxides. Strictly speaking, nitrous oxides are going to include NO, which is nitrogen monoxide, and NO2, nitrogen dioxide. Okay, so it's that X is a variable right there, either a 1 or a 2. However, sometimes you will see that nitrous oxide, N2O, is included in that too. But strictly speaking, it shouldn't be. Now, nitrous oxide has a couple other names, N2O. You can say either dinitrogen oxide or dinitrogen monoxide. That'd be probably the best way to say that, dinitrogen monoxide, but most people just say nitrous oxide. Okay. These nitrous oxides are produced from any type of combustion, like I've said, especially at high temperatures. For most of that, we're looking at over 50% in most of our major cities from transportation, right? Cars, trucks, etc. Anything that's burning with an internal combustion engine. Secondarily to that is going to be your stationary fuel combustion. This is stuff like your power plants, or even probably including home stoves and things like that. But think power plants for stationary fuel combustion. And then we have some from industry, and then miscellaneous, okay, only 3%. So for photochemical smog, these are the most effective cities as of a couple years ago when I found these articles. Worldwide, we see these cities listed. What I want you to notice is that they are very large cities that are highly populated, and that most of these are in tropical regions, right? There's a few exceptions to that, right? Beijing, Moscow are not in tropical regions, but most of these are in those areas where it's, Ulaanbaatar also, where it's hot and dry for at least a portion of the year. And all of these, it's hot and dry for at least a portion of the year, but some of them all year round. Then I also have the list of US cities. Okay, you notice that the top, 6 of them are in California, followed by 2 in Texas, and then another California one further down. Again, hot and dry areas with high population densities. You also notice that none of these US cities, Los Angeles, does not top this list as the top 10 worldwide. Okay, because of the Clean Air Act and other similar legislation in the United States, we have limited the amount of photochemical smog in US cities. The Clean Air Act really has been modeled by many other nations around the world, but you see that there is still some catching up to do, especially in developing nations, for reducing and managing and monitoring smog levels. Now, so let's look at the negative human health effects. There's going to be various human health effects because of the varied chemical composition of smog. If we look back at that list on the previous slide, Ulaanbaatar that primarily uses coal burning power plants, it might be very different from the effects that you see in someplace else that might be mostly from vehicle transportation, for example. Okay. But in general, it's going to photochemical smog is going to most adversely affect the young and old and those with pre-existing conditions. When we say pre-existing conditions, we mean people that have asthma, people that develop bronchitis when they were very young and have some scarring of their bronchial tissue. Maybe people that maybe older folks that smoked for much of their life and have emphysema. All right, those are pre-existing conditions that smog will exacerbate. Even stuff that's genetic, like multiple sclerosis, they will have more adverse effects to smog. In general, it irritates your mucous membranes, eyes, nose, mouth, throat, mucous membranes, even down into your lungs, and it can therefore weaken your primary immune system, especially the nose and the throat, because that's where your immune system, does start. You can start to have lung issues with repeated chronic exposure. That can include shortness of breath, coughing, wheezing, asthma, bronchitis, emphysema, potentially cancer. Okay. Many of the chemicals in smog, especially formaldehyde, are carcinogenic. Okay, I probably spelled that wrong. Formaldehyde. Sorry about that. And then long-term exposure isn't really well known, but it has been potentially linked to Alzheimer's disease, birth defects, and low birth weight if the mother is repeatedly exposed to smog, and premature death. And in fact, it's estimated by the World Health Organization that there's 7 million premature deaths every year from photochemical smog alone. That's not including all of the rest of the pollutants in your major cities. So all of the particulate matter and everything else, that's just photochemical smog or smog in general. Okay, so I guess it can include particulate matter with winter smog. So how can we change this? What are some solutions to reducing photochemical smog? First is switching to renewable energy sources. If we don't have coal burning power plants, then we're not releasing that particulate matter, the sulfur oxides, the nitrous oxides, the volatile organic compounds that can be coming off of it. We can install devices on those power plants as well if we do have them to reduce the amount of primary pollutants that go into the atmosphere too. But just sticking with renewables, if you have solar panels on your roof and you have an electric car, you are not contributing to the smog issue directly, okay? Maybe indirectly from the manufacturing of those panels, but it'd be much, much, much less than if you are getting your electricity every day from coal burning power plants, okay? Your electric vehicle is not going to produce any emissions as it runs. Obviously, there's going to be emissions tied to the manufacturing, but as it runs on the road, it's producing no primary pollutants, which is going to create no secondary pollutants and therefore no smog. Okay, so switching to renewables is huge. Reducing your emissions. So we've talked about CAFE standards, the vehicle emission standards in the United States. As we reduce the amount, as we make cars more efficient, run on less fuel, we reduce the amount of primary pollutants and therefore secondary pollutants as well. And then by capturing some of those pollutants or by having devices on our vehicles, on our power plants that can reduce those emissions, we're therefore reducing smog as well. So a catalytic converter on your car, its job is to react with or cause some of those primary pollutants that produce smog. It causes them to react and to be released as just simple nitrogen gas, as water vapor, and as carbon dioxide, so non-smog causing chemicals. Okay. We can conserve energy, increase efficiency, right? We're putting less demand on those power plants if they are fossil fuel based, and even if they're not, using environmentally friendly products that don't release pollutants. So like volatile organic compounds, I can choose in my wood shop, for example, not to use varnish or lacquer thinner or paint thinner or any of those chemical-based solvents the that have those volatile organic compounds coming off of them, volatilizing all the time. I can instead choose to use something like waxes, beeswax maybe, that might be more environmentally friendly, as well as in their sourcing, as well as reducing the amount of volatile organic compounds going into the atmosphere. Okay. Simple things like monitoring air quality, like having smog alert days like we do, or air quality alert days like we do in Denver, and saying like, please do not mow your lawn, for example, during these hours because we want to mitigate the amount of primary pollutants that are going into the atmosphere during the heat of the day. Okay, so regulating and monitoring air quality, buying local products, which reduces shipping. And then we have some cool technical solutions. So smog filtering towers, this is an example of that. There's actually a Dutch company that's taking the carbon from these towers, so it's not just reducing smog, but it's capturing carbon as well. And they're using that carbon to create synthetic diamonds. Now, there's probably a huge energy cost into that, but it is some form of carbon capture as well. And then catalytic buildings, this is an example of one of those on the bottom right. All of that spider web looking stuff out there is it's like a polymer or a cement alternative that reacts with ozone and captures that ozone and essentially filters the air, kind of like how trees do. And in fact, another way to reduce photochemical smog is just to plant trees. Okay, vegetation is really good at removing many different chemicals out of the air. All right, so that was a pretty short PowerPoint. So let's talk about the essential knowledge. Photochemical smog is formed when nitrogen oxides and volatile organic hydrocarbons. We are calling those volatile organic compounds that include hydrocarbons. Okay. They are released into the atmosphere. They react with heat, sunlight, and water to produce a variety of pollutants. And those variety of pollutants is what we call photochemical smog. Okay. Many environmental factors affect the formation of photochemical smog. Again, think sunlight, heat, the amount of precipitation in an area, as well as the latitude. Nitrogen oxide is produced early in the day. Ozone concentrations peak in the afternoon and are higher in the summer because ozone is produced by chemical reaction between oxygen and sunlight. So sunlight is higher in the summer, so you're going to have more ozone in the summer. And then it's going to peak midday or in the afternoon because you need those primary pollutants to be emitted first to then react with the sunlight, which increases in intensity as you get later in the day. Your volatile organic compounds, such as formaldehyde and gasoline, evaporate or sublimate at room temperature. Remember that evaporation is from liquid to gas, and then sublimate is from a solid to gas. And then trees are also natural sources of volatile organic compounds. We did not talk about that in this PowerPoint, but remember in previous PowerPoints that vegetation, whenever you smell any type of chemical from anything living, it's coming from a volatile organic compound. So the perfume coming from a rose flower is a volatile organic compound. Trees are a pretty big source of volatile organic compounds, but nothing compared to fossil fuels or from industry or transportation. Okay. Photochemical smog often forms in urban areas because of the large number of motor vehicles. Photochemical smog can be reduced through the reduction of nitrous oxides and volatile organic compounds. And photochemical smog can harm human health, okay, especially respiratory problems. And then we talked about thermal inversions as well, but I'm going to let you read this and kind of skip it. All right, so I hope you guys learned something. I'll see you on class.